How's it going, guys and geeks? Welcome to Geekritique. My name is Dakota, and I'm proud to introduce you to a brand new series called Is Canon, where we take a deep dive into different films, shows, or other to determine if certain titles are canonical. Sometimes the answer is very clear, and sometimes it really isn't. So more than just simply answering that main question, we plan to determine where and when each title takes place in universe, how it affects other titles in that universe, and if plot holes make it less canonical. At the end of the video, we'll rate the title's canonicity rating between 1 and 100. Currently, the most popular shared universe in the world is the MCU. With some 20 films and nearly a dozen shows, it's massive. The latest MCU show, Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1, is what we'll be discussing today. If you have ideas for future But Is It Canon episodes, let us know in the comments down below. We're seriously going to need your help, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an opportunity to vote in our polls before each video to help us in identifying the canonicity of each title. 733 of you voted into today's show, so let's go ahead and ask the big question: is Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 canon in the MCU? There are a surprising amount of connections to the Marvel Universe in this series, from large corporations that we've seen in previous MCU titles to straight out name-dropping huge Marvel characters. But there are also big issues that might separate the series from the larger MCU. We'll discuss all that and more right after this.
Reality is...
Intro was a tad long, but I hope you liked it. The goal is that the last 4 to 5 seconds will feature scenes from the topic at hand. If you liked it, please be sure to leave a thumbs up to let us know. So first things first, we asked and you answered. Thank you to all that voted into our first poll in the But Is It Canon series. 63% of you said that yes, Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 is canon in the MCU, while 19 of you answered no. Another 18% of you chose to ask, what is canon? That's a great question, and the answer changes somewhat with each franchise as different rules need to be applied. And no, we are not talking about weaponry, and we're definitely not talking about the camera company. A canon is a collection of works, whether they be books, films, comics, shows, or other, that are generally considered part of a greater whole, thematically, artistically, or narratively. Within the MCU, we'll be talking narrative canon, because as you likely already know, they've got some 20 films that are directed by different people, starring different actors, fighting different villains, but somehow, magically, they all narratively connect together like adjacent pieces to a far larger jigsaw puzzle. This also means that there are some films based on Marvel Comics characters that aren't canon MCU films, like the Fox-produced X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Deadpool movies, or any Sony Spider-Man films that preceded Spider-Man Homecoming. What you may not realize, however, is that there are several other titles connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe that, by their very nature, aren't cinematic, but are still connected to the Marvel films in one way or another. MCU canon has several tiers of canonicity. The first being any Marvel Studios films. Then you have the handful of one-shot shorts that were produced by Marvel Studios. Tier 3 would be any direct spin-off shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or Agent Carter. The fourth tier, as I see it, are shows that aren't direct spin-offs to the films, but reside in the same universe, though they don't ever interact with the films. And Tier 5 would be any comics, web series, or in-world promotional material that is tangentially related to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's my personal interpretation of MCU canon, and mileage may vary depending on how others rank canonicity. So where does Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 fit in the MCU canon? Well, based on the 5 tiers that were listed, it's currently in the 4th tier. That doesn't mean it isn't canon, but as the track record for 4th tier MCU titles go, expect it to have little to no effect on any MCU films in the future. That said, Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 is an extraordinarily well put together series, playing on the thematic dissonance that the concepts of hope and fear have on each other. Let's give a brief overview of who Cloak and Dagger are first, and please note that this video does contain spoilers. As children, Tandy Bowen and Tyrone Johnson become inexplicably linked in a failed drilling accident in New Orleans when an oil rig explodes. The rig we find was drilling a new type of energy that, for the sake of this video, we'll call the Dark Force and the Light Force. The Dark Force imbues Tyrone with the ability to teleport and to prey on people's fears. The Light Force gives Tandy the ability to create projectile daggers and to see someone's hopes and dreams. The series revolves around the two attempting to find answers that were buried relating to the accident and the deaths of Tandy's father and Tyrone's brother. The powers Tyrone and Tandy receive from the explosion are both extremely cool and thematically brilliant. The girl who runs from everything out of fear and dreams of nothing is given the ability to see the hopes and desires of others, giving her a means to push past the person she became after the accident. Tyrone, on the other hand, is an idealist surrounded by those who, in one way or another, fear the world they live in so much that they choose not to act. And it isn't until Tyrone is given the ability to see and manifest fear that he's given a roadblock, one he's more than willing to overcome. On top of that, Tyrone's ability to teleport is very cool and extremely rare in the MCU. Actually, scratch that. It's not rare at all.
Piss off, Ghost!
Tandy, on the other hand, is capable of creating the perfect weapon. A dagger made of pure light, which appears to be able to slice through whatever Tandy desires with ease, and dissipates on anything she doesn't intend to hit, and or when she no longer needs it. That could have really come in handy with the likes of Thanos, alongside all the tech, webs, ships, and magic being thrown his way.
Oh, magic. Just science we don't understand.
Speaking of Thanos, spoilers for Infinity War, I'll give you a second to leave this video if you have not seen that film yet. Second over! This show dropped after Infinity War. Why haven't half the cast been snapped into oblivion at this point? Well, that's because the show conveniently takes place chronologically before Infinity War. How long before? The answer might surprise you, or it might not, I don't know. Now, the timeline for this show is particularly tricky. We know this because we've scoured just about every frame of it. Why?
When we stop looking for something, that's when we let it disappear, right?
That, and because we have a whole video series on mapping the MCU timeline, which you can check out right here. I know, shameless plug. So let's figure out when this show takes place. We'll start by examining the age of Billy Jackson, Tyrone's brother, when he died. Take note that throughout this video we'll be examining many documents and props created for the series, and that they were created by a team of individuals tasked to essentially beef up the world building of this series by writing articles, websites, identity cards, and more. These items often contradict one another and weren't intended to be as heavily scrutinized as they have been in the making of this video. So hopefully by the time they get around to making the props for Season 2, they'll have watched this video and decide to make it more coherent. So back to Billy. According to this newspaper clipping the camera draws our attention to, Billy was 17 years old and was born on August 1st, 1990. This means that the day he was shot must have been between August 1st, 2007 and September 30th, 2008. During a nightmare sequence, we see that Billy went missing on May 5th, 2008 on a milk carton. But again, this is more likely an arbitrary date placed on a prop. I'm more inclined to trust this scene that shares video footage from the night of the explosion, which says it took place on April 18th, 2007. Making Billy not 17. Do you see my problem? Okay, so he was almost 17, which contradicts that first article. Which is then contradicted by Nathan Bowen, Tandy's father's Roxanne ID card issued almost a year later. Now, considering this video footage is literally the most crucial evidence we have as it's the most prominent date featured in the entire show, that's the date mark we'll use to figure out when the present time period is for the rest of the series. Are you still following? Kinda? Okay, by our logic, the present day for this series takes place in 2015, 8 years later. How do we know that? Well, this is something the writers of the series really wanted to make clear.
8 years ago.
From 8 years ago?
8 years ago.
8 years ago.
For 8 years.
8 years ago. 8 years ago.
Past 8 years have sucked.
Near the end of the first season, we find that it's exactly 8 years since Billy's death and the explosion of the Roxanne oil rig. So naturally, it should be April 18th, 2015, right? Well, that's contradicted by a Thursday, October 5th date popping up on Ty's phone, though this is most likely the date that they filmed in 2017. And that's contradicted by this leap year calendar from February 2012, which is then contradicted by the high school basketball state championships, which occur in early March. But then Mardi Gras 2015 occurs on February 17th. Another contradiction. And then there's this Roxanne ID card which doesn't bother giving us years, meaning the card either never expires or it's always expired. I give up. Marvel TV clearly doesn't care when this show takes place, so long as it doesn't take place anytime within the past few years. Executive decision right here, right now on But Is It Canon, Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 takes place in April 2015. Shortly after Daredevil and Jessica Jones begin their crime-fighting days in Hell's Kitchen, and just weeks short of the Avengers dropping a city out of the sky. Let's take a step back from the MCU timeline a bit. Get a little breather. But also note that it'll be important to revisit later on as it helps explain two massive MCU Easter eggs in relation to other Marvel shows, and especially the films. For now, it's time we talked about the big bad corporate entity of the series. The same corporate entity whose oil rig blew in 2007 in New Orleans, and the ones who were responsible for letting these zombie-like terrors loose on the city 8 years later.
Does the name Roxxon mean anything to you?
It should. In 1946, or rather, the first episode of the Captain America spin-off series Agent Carter, we got our earliest look at the Roxxon Corporation, and even then they were up to sketchy stuff. However, instead of exploding like the Roxxon Golf platform in Cloak-and-Dagger, the Roxxon refinery in Agent Carter imploded. Years later, we see Roxxon show up in not one, not two, but all three Iron Man movies. We even see Roxxon represented in a legal case in Daredevil Season 1. And while a large in-universe company may seem like a very minor Easter egg in regards to the MCU as a whole, it does connect some dots, especially with Iron Man. But more on that in a minute. What is Roxxon's ultimate goal here? 8 years ago, they didn't have the proper pumps installed to maintain the heat that was being expended from the drilling, and the Roxxon Golf platform ultimately exploded, unfortunately killing Tandy's father, Nathan Bowen. His name, his money, his reputation, and his family are dragged through the mud by Roxxon. The true nature of what was being mined was covered up, but the project continued. Valves were placed throughout the city of New Orleans to continue drilling what was perceived to be oil. But
We are drilling for oil.
now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a very, very similar plot element to other Marvel TV series. In the past year, this is the third time a sinister organization has been discovered to be digging, mining, or drilling for something other than what they claim. In the Defenders, the Hand organization was secretly drilling a hole hundreds of feet deep to harvest dragon fossils.
Last year when I was investigating the Hand, the trail led me to a construction site, which is now Midland Circle. There was a hole there, hundreds of feet deep.
In the middle of New York?
Yeah.
And you're just now remembering this.
And in Runaways, we learn that the Church of Gibberim is digging down to find some mysterious living being underground. And now this. Either Marvel's TV division has run out of ideas, or their motto is, keep digging holes in the MCU until the Avengers take notice. Yeah. So what are Roxxon drilling for, if not oil? While the show doesn't give it a name, the comics refer to the two energy sources that dwell in tandem as Dark Force and Light Force.
Let it burn 10 times better than oil.
But it's also very dangerous, because if it touches you,
It turns, well, everyone but me, and now you, into bloodthirsty monsters. I call them terrors.
so why bother drilling it?
Power. And with great power comes even more power. In this day and age, you need to keep up with the Joneses, as well as the Starks and the Rands.
Okay, wow, lot to unpack there. Several layers of Easter eggs and references in one go. This is Peter Scarborough, the head of the Gulf Division of the Roxxon Corporation. First, he drops a somewhat meta joke that parodies the now classic and decidedly non-canonical line spoken by Uncle Ben in the 2002 Spider-Man film.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Then he utters this century-old phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, which denotes that the Roxxon Corporation is struggling to stay afloat with other billion-dollar companies. Specifically, Stark Industries and Rand Enterprises. Why is this significant? Well, he straight out tells Tandy, and ultimately the audience, that this self-contained story exists in the same universe that Tony Stark and the other Avengers inhabit. And for a quick refresher, Rand Enterprises is the name of the company created by Danny Rand, aka Iron Fist's father. But it's interesting he mentions power in reference to those two names. Could he be specifically talking about some form of physical or technological super ability that these two names would both definitely be associated with? Well, it's unlikely. Remember again, this is occurring in 2015. Sure, Tony Stark had been Iron Man for almost 7 years at this point, but Danny Rand was still cut off from the rest of the world in Kunlun, and Rand Enterprises was then being run by the Meacham family. Thankfully, we have this look from Tandy into Scarborough's deepest desire. It appears that hoarding money, no matter the amount of dead left in his wake, is his ultimate idea of power, and harnessing a fuel that burns 10 times better than oil would definitely make for a very rich man. So more likely this reference denotes Roxxon's competitors as opposed to those characters' individual power. Now, mentioning Stark by name is a huge MCU connection. But the Rand connection is also big. They're trying to tell us that in the scheme of things, they're just as related to the Iron Man franchise as they are the Iron Fist franchise, or more accurately, the Netflix side of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because this isn't actually the show's biggest connection to an MCU property. In fact, it's time we take notice of Detective Bridget O'Reilly, a newcomer on the scene who previously worked in Harlem.
In Harlem, it was a good way to leap up the food chain. Thought maybe I could make some noise. But New Orleans is a different bird.
Who else do we know from Harlem? Well, a lot of characters actually. But after seeing Cloak's powers firsthand, her colleague Officer Fuchs asks her about it.
I'm from New York. I've seen it before.
This is unsurprising, considering the seeming overpopulation of MCU heroes who live and or originate from New York City. But notice what she says next.
I ever tell you about my friend Misty?
Well, that's awesome. Here she's referring to the one and only Misty Knight, who features prominently in both seasons of Marvel's Luke Cage, as well as in The Defenders. But it's strange, considering we've never seen the two work together. So is it possible she's talking about having seen Luke Cage firsthand here, or perhaps one of the many other New York-based heroes? Well, thanks to this seemingly one-off line from Luke Cage Season 2, the plot thickens.
Inspector West called. Callahan is in Maui, and O'Reilly moved to New Orleans, and none of them know you quit.
At first glance, it seems as though O'Reilly literally just moved to New Orleans. But then Nandi tells Misty this.
West said, until One Police Plaza sends somebody else, you're the highest ranking detective here.
Now, considering what we know, the fact that O'Reilly was not only a high-ranking detective, but also a close friend of Misty Knight's, enough even to name-drop her in a casual conversation about superpowers, there is no way Misty didn't already know that she had moved to New Orleans. That phone call from Inspector West was no more than a formality, and Nandi's preamble was nothing more than a few rhetorical statements. And considering that the events of Luke Cage Season 1 hadn't even been set into motion when Cloak-and-Dagger was taking place, this suddenly fits together so much better. In fact, the Hulk rampaged through Harlem in 2010, so O'Reilly definitely would have been present for that. These shoutouts are literally taking place over a 2-year period, despite both shows airing around the same time. Could this mean that we'll see the Cloak-and-Dagger cast team up with the Defenders casts? Just maybe.
I can tell you that we're all hoping for a crossover episode, so either me going over to Luke Cage or them coming over to Cloak-and-Dagger. But I love Simone, she's amazing, and we talked about, let's even just film something on an iPhone in a car park and release it as like our crossover episode. Yeah, I would love to team up with Misty.
I did not realize she was Australian. Before we give Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 a canonicity rating, I want to take this time to thank our patrons over at Patreon. Unless this video somehow gets picked up by the algorithm or Reddit, I doubt very highly YouTube will adequately pay me back for the time spent on this project. And you who've been following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Discord know how much time we've put into this over the past couple weeks. That said, you awesome few who number literally less than 0.1% of our total subscriber base that choose to help us monetarily every month, we want you to know that this video is for you. Thank you so very much. Your help honestly humbles us every month. So how our canonicity rating works is half of the total score is based on my analysis, and the other half is entirely dependent on you voting in the polls. So out of the 733 of you who voted, 82% of you voted either yes or no. And of that 82%, about 76% of you voted that it was canon. So half of that is roughly 38 points. We'll add another 10 points for the very rare Tier 1 name drop of Tony Stark, 5 points for the Tier 4 name drop of Rand, another 15 points for the personal connection between Detectives O'Reilly and Knight, 10 points for the big part that Roxxon played, and 2 points for the potential connections to the Defenders and Runaways. We'll subtract 5 for the iffy placement on the MCU timeline. This means that Cloak-and-Dagger Season 1 receives a canonicity rating of 75 out of 100. I'd certainly consider that canon. What did you guys think of this video? If you enjoyed it and you want to help us out, there are a number of ways you can do so. First and foremost, like and subscribe, comment your thoughts and any ideas for future episodes, and of course, share this with others who might enjoy it. We invite you also to check out our Patreon page so you can help directly fund the production of videos just like this. We thank you all so very much for watching, and stay tuned for the next opportunity you'll get to vote in our But Is It Canon polls so your voice is heard. Thanks guys, have a good one.